6C. This is the overview of Sustainable Groundwater Management Act.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Dakota Corey, and I'm the water supply analyst for the city of Santa Barbara. And today I'm going to present an overview on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which is commonly referred to as SGMA. In today's presentation, we'll do a quick overview of the city's groundwater resources, which kind of provides the context for how SGMA might affect the city. We'll look at a couple of approaches the city has available to it for groundwater management strategies. I'll also give a quick overview of the SGMA legislation, including requirements, and then we'll talk about some of the benefits and challenges of forming a groundwater sustainability agency for the city, and we'll talk about a potential timeline associated with that formation. So to start, we'll just look quickly at what the city's groundwater resources are. As you know, groundwater is a critical part of the city's water supply portfolio, especially during times of drought, when surface waters from the Santa Ynez River and the State Water Project may be not as available to the city as they are in wet years. Groundwater is a truly local supply. The city is the primary pumper in both of our groundwater basins, and we operate several production wells and treatment facilities within the basins. Per the city's long-term water supply plan, groundwater is conjunctively managed by the city, and what that means is that we store groundwater in the ground during wet years and save it for drought periods. During wet years, the basins are rested and they're allowed to replenish through infiltration. Additionally, we do have some wells that are capable of groundwater injection, which gives us the option of augmenting groundwater water supplies through water recycling and stormwater capture and reuse. This here is a map of our groundwater basins. You can see the red outline that highlights the city's boundaries, and then the black hash marked outlines are the outlines of the groundwater basins. And I first want to look at the combination here, I think you can see the pointer a little bit, of Storage Unit 1 and Storage Unit 3. Together, these storage units make up the Santa Barbara Basin. They are considered distinct groundwater storage, distinct basins, sub-basins within the Santa Barbara Basin. We have several production wells in Storage Unit 1, and you can see that it underlies most of the downtown area of the city. And then to the southwest of that, we have Storage Unit 3. We have one production well in Storage Unit 3. The water quality there isn't fantastic, and so we use that as a non-potable backup supply to our recycled water system. In the northwest portion of the city, you can see that we have the Foothill Groundwater Basin. It underlies both city or parcels within the city boundaries and areas outside of the city limits, including Mission Canyon here, which we do serve water to even though they're outside of city boundaries. And while it's not on the map, I do want to direct your attention to the east side of the city here. Over here is where the Montecito groundwater basin exists, and it's actually adjacent to the Santa Barbara Basin down here, and then up towards the top it kind of comes close to our Foothill Basins. And that's going to be important as we continue on in the presentation talking about groundwater sustainability agencies, since they're moving forward with forming a groundwater sustainability agency. So, looking more closely at the Santa Barbara Basin, which again is comprised of storage units 1 and 3, this is our largest source of groundwater for the city. Storage Unit 1 is. And it serves Storage Unit 1 is vulnerable to seawater intrusion because it's close to the Pacific Ocean. The city is the only known primary pumper in Storage Unit 1, and water is pumped from 4 different wells that's then treated at the Ortega Groundwater Treatment Plant prior to entering the water distribution system. As was mentioned in the previous presentation, we hope to bring Alameda Well, which is also in Storage Unit 1, online to feeding to the groundwater treatment plant as well. The Foothill Basin, which was that basin that was in the northwestern portion of the city, exists both within city limits and outside of city limits. There's currently 3 main city production wells within the Foothill Basin, and those are chlorinated prior to the water being fed into the city's distribution system. There are some other known pumpers within the Foothill Basin. Those include La Cumbra Mutual Water Company, the Lincolnwood neighborhood, San Vicente, and privately held wells primarily serving residences in the Mission Canyon area, which again is that area outside of city limits. So next we'll discuss briefly different approaches that the city has available to it to manage our groundwater resources outside of SGMA. Outside of SGMA, we have two different approaches. There's adjudication, and there's also regulations that are included in the Municipal Code and enforced by police powers. So adjudication is when you have multiple pumpers in a basin, and they ask the courts to better define water rights to pump water from that basin. Typically, there's a water master assigned during adjudication that makes sure that pumping conforms to the limits that were set by the courts. And one thing that's good about adjudication is it can take pumpers that aren't wanting to conform to pumping limits and bring them within a court order so that everybody is pumping in a way that protects the groundwater resources. Adjudication, though, takes decades to complete because it's a court process, and it doesn't allow for flexible or adaptive management of the groundwater resources because anytime you want to change the court order, you go back to court, and that takes a long time. So the city would prefer not to go down the path of adjudication. Another option that we have to manage our groundwater resources currently is developing rules regarding groundwater usage through our municipal code, and those are enforceable via our city police powers. So to look at that a little bit more closely, we currently develop rules and regulations regarding groundwater usage through our municipal code. For example, Chapter 14.32 of the Municipal Code addresses groundwater wells. These rules only apply within city boundaries, however, and so therefore they're not enforceable in areas within our basins that are located outside of city limits, such as those in the Foothill Basin. Recently, in response to the current drought conditions, the city amended its municipal code to prohibit the drilling of private wells that for parcels that were either served by the city water system or feasibly served by the city water system. In addition to regulations in our municipal code, the city has been studying and monitoring our groundwater basins for decades, often in partnership with the USGS. We currently have an agreement with USGS that includes 60 monitoring wells for water level and 40 wells for water quality. Of those 40 wells for water quality, there's 8 wells that we specifically look at chlorides to help us track seawater intrusion in Storage Unit 1. The city is also working with USGS to develop a detailed numeric groundwater model in order to estimate the sustainable yield of our basins and also to inform our pumping practices. In addition to the work that we've done with USGS in the basins, we're also a monitoring entity under the CASGEM program. CASGEM stands for the California Statewide Groundwater Elevation and Monitoring Program. We submit monthly groundwater levels to the Department of Water Resources, and those are used for overall state planning regarding the state's groundwater resources. In addition, we recently completed a feasibility study regarding artificial recharge of the groundwater basins with recycled water. And our newer groundwater wells have recharge capabilities, and we'd like to start a pilot study that allows us to explore doing artificial recharge in wet years or when Consuma is spilling. We'd start with one well before expanding to additional wells, and we have done some injection in the past with some water quality concerns that resulted from that, but now we have newer wells and different operating procedures, so we think the pilot study could allow more success in the future. That's why we'd like to try it out.
Just as a caveat to that, the injection is typically half the rate of extraction. So if we have a well that's producing 500 GPM, the fastest you can put water back into the ground is 250 GPM. So there are some significant limitations to how quickly you could really benefit. The best way to get water in the basin is through its natural means, typically our local creeks.
Injection also, just trying to remember another life, but injection also involves the water has to be down there a period of time, right, before you can pull it up for reuse?
Related to potable reuse, that's correct. For
Okay.
the indirect potable reuse, it needs to spend, and it depends on how much treatment you do. But
So as part of our study, I think they use DNA markers, right? So they So you put water in somewhere, and you either leave it down there a certain period of time, or you can actually put water in there, and if it travels horizontally over a period of time, and you're, right? I'm
Right.
kind of on the right track here,
Correct,
right?
yes.
And so I get what you're saying is the extraction is half, but do we have that capability for that type of horizontal transfer in period of time to where then we can pull it somewhere, we can put it in one place and pull it somewhere else?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Jordan, in the feasibility study, that was, I think, one of the challenges we would face. It identified potentially an additional roughly 20 new wells that we'd have to install to do indirect potable reuse. We don't currently have any place to locate those, any land or sites identified, and they would have to be located in places that allowed that travel time to occur, and also not be in locations that might be near sensitive habitat in case there's mounding issues. So we have, I think that particular issue of where we would put the wells is one of the largest challenges we would have with doing indirect potable reuse.
Thanks.
All right, so now let's get into the meat of SGMA a little bit, and it's actually just going to be an overview. I won't bog you down with legislative language. So on September 16th, 2014, Governor Jerry Brown signed a three-bill legislative package that was comprised of AB 1739, SB 1168, and SB 1319, comprehensively known as the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA. In general, SGMA requires governments and water agencies to halt overdraft and to bring their groundwater basins to balanced levels of pumping and recharge. Under SGMA, basins are expected to reach sustainability within 20 years from implementing their groundwater sustainability plan. And SGMA empowers local agencies to form GSAs, or Groundwater Sustainability Agencies, and to implement GSPs, or Groundwater Sustainability Plans, for crucial groundwater basins in California. And I did want to direct your attention to the quote at the bottom of the slide. One thing that's important about the intent of SGMA was to really keep the management of groundwater local, because it is a local resource. And so Governor Brown stated that a central feature of these bills is the recognition that groundwater management in California is best accomplished locally rather than a top-down approach from the state. So sustainable groundwater management is defined in SGMA as the management and use of groundwater in a manner that can be maintained during the planning and implementation horizon without causing undesirable results. So what are undesirable results? SGMA further goes on to define undesirable results as chronic lowering of groundwater levels, significant and unreasonable reduction of groundwater storage, significant and unreasonable seawater intrusion, significant and unreasonable degraded water quality, including the migration of contaminant plumes that impair water supply, significant and unreasonable land subsidence that substantially interferes with surface land uses, depletions of interconnected surface water that have significant and unreasonable adverse impacts on the beneficial uses of that surface water. I do want to note that land subsidence isn't an issue here locally, although it is a major issue in other places of the state, namely the Central Valley. And also wanted to note that DWR recently released a series of best management practices to address these undesirable results as agencies are moving forward to develop their groundwater sustainability plans. So then what are the requirements under SGMA? Prior to SGMA, in 2009, the California Comprehensive Water Package required DWR to prioritize the California groundwater basins in order to help identify, evaluate, and determine the need for additional groundwater monitoring. When SGMA came along, that added further requirements for DWR to develop the initial groundwater basin priorities by January 31st, 2015. So using the CASGEM data that we contribute to, a final basin prioritization was released and under SGMA, and it initially designated 127 groundwater basins as either medium or high priority. These 127 basins represent approximately 96% of the groundwater usage in the state and also account for about 88% of the state's population. And on this slide, I listed the characteristics that CASGEM and DWR looked at to determine the ranking of each of the groundwater basins in the state. So you can see that there's things like population, there's how much water is pumped, if there is how much the community relies on groundwater as a primary source, et cetera. So under the requirements of SGMA, only basins that are designated as either medium or high priority have required actions. And for those basins, they first must form a groundwater sustainability agency, and that was actually required by June 30th, 2017, so most of those have been formed. And now those groundwater sustainability agencies are working on groundwater sustainability plans. And depending on the prioritization, those plans must be completed either by 2022 or for basins that are critically overdrafted, they have to complete their plans by 2020. Under SGMA, these basins should reach sustainability within 20 years of implementing their plans. So that means for most of the high and medium priority basins, they should be reaching sustainability in 2042, and the critically overdrafted basins should be reaching sustainability in 2040. Yeah.
Are any of our basins in the medium or high priority?
That's my next
designation?
sentence. Good question. So basins designated as low or very low priority, including those underlying the city, so both of our basins, have an option to implement a groundwater sustainability agency and groundwater sustainability plan, but at a timeline of the agency she's choosing, and also we don't have to implement it at all. So to further explain, the city's two groundwater basins, the Foothill Basin and the Santa Barbara Basin, each had pumpage less than 2,000 acre-feet per year in the CASGEM data set that was used to do the prioritization, which was a 2010 data set. And there was also no significant impacts or issues documented within our basins. So we were automatically ranked as very low priority groundwater basins. It should be noted that DWR has a legislative requirement to update its basin prioritization, and that would be based on updated CASGEM data as well as basin boundary modifications. So agencies have been going through and using geological studies and USGS reports to better define their groundwater basins under SGMA, and now with those new basin boundaries, that could affect their prioritization. So we're currently waiting results of that reprioritization. It was actually due almost a year ago now, and we're still waiting for that from DWR. If the city's basins are reprioritized to either medium or high, we'd have 2 years from the date of that reprioritization to form a GSA, and then 5 years from the date of that reprioritization to develop a groundwater sustainability plan. So what would be the benefits and challenges of forming a GSA for the city specifically? There's definitely benefits associated with the SGMA legislative package. GSA formation is consistent with the city's water supply planning policies, including the 2011 long-term water supply plan, which recommended that the city develop a groundwater management plan. GSA formation establishes the regulatory and financial framework for long-term management of the city's groundwater resources. It also establishes a basis for intergovernmental cooperation between neighboring agencies for activities that impact the groundwater basins but may not be located within the city's boundaries. Finally, GSA formation allows for cost sharing of groundwater management activities among all pumpers within the basin. There's also some challenges and risks associated with GSA formation specific to the city. First, SGMA's a relatively new legislative package, and those agencies that are required to form GSAs and develop GSPs are working with DWR right now to kind of sort out the implementation issues. There's still new data being developed by the state currently, and so there's probably value for the city to wait a little bit and learn from other agencies' experiences. At the city staff level, the current drought requires staff to focus on critical needs. GSA formation and the development of a GSP would require significant staff time to complete a number of activities, including extensive outreach to stakeholders, development of a technical groundwater sustainability plan, development and implementation of the management programs defined within that plan, the submission of annual reports to DWR, and periodic evaluation of the groundwater sustainability plan and any changing conditions. Despite these challenges, staff does feel that the regulatory framework associated with the GSA formation would be beneficial as the city continues to manage its groundwater resources. So what could a potential timeline look like? Before we jump into a specific timeline related to the city, I wanted to bring up Montecito Water District, our neighbors to the east. They manage the adjacent Montecito Groundwater Basin. And as I mentioned, when we looked at the map, it's actually congruent to the Santa Barbara Basin that we manage. And they are also designated as a very low priority basin at this time. But Montecito Water District is a water agency, so unlike us as a city, they have even more limited powers on what they can do to manage the basin. And I included this map in the slide, and you can see over here on the far right-hand side, there's this area of interest. And if you look at where the box is, it's right over the top of the main commercial area, residential area of Montecito. And when you blow that up, you can see that there's been hundreds of private well applications in Montecito's service area in the past several years. And so forming a GSA would allow them additional management capabilities within their groundwater basin.
They have about 1,000 wells in their service area, just to give you an idea. They're all relatively small wells, a couple gallons a minute, but getting a handle on those has been huge. The district has, 2 or 3 wells that they use, and of course, with the cost of water and everything going up, everyone's trying to find water for their irrigation, and so I think Montecito is trying to bring everybody together and be thinking more holistically about the groundwater management.
Would they need us to form a GSA?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Snedden, we're working on an MOU because we have certain areas of their groundwater basin that overlie city or within the city limits, and so we intend on partnering with them on that because we do see the benefit to them for managing their groundwater basins. But there are areas within the city that it's a small portions there's an overlap area. So that's why we're working on an MOU is for those small overlap areas.
And that transitions really nicely to our next slide, which is that staff is currently working with Montecito Water District as they work to form their groundwater sustainability agency. We're currently reviewing an MOU that would work for both us as a city and the Montecito Water District as they move forward in forming their GSA. We expect to bring that back to Water Commission for review sometime this year, probably not in the too far out future. Beyond working with Montecito, the city plans to wait a little while in order to benefit from lessons learned by other agencies, both locally and statewide, that are currently going through GSA formation and the development of their groundwater sustainability plans. Currently, we're tentatively planning to initiate GSA formation for our 2 basins, the Santa Barbara and Foothill Basins, in 2021, unless the new state rankings come out and our basin priority is changed, and that would require earlier implementation. So that concludes my presentation, unless there's any questions.
Good. Thank you very much for the presentation. Other questions? Kristen?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Sure.
Michael?
Mr. Chair. So the advantages you showed over forming a GSA, those would really only be advantages if we had either an MOU or another GSA on the areas that are adjacent and overlapping to our ground basins, right? There'd be no advantage to be the only one on that map with a GSA. Is that correct?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Jordan, we would need the other areas outside of the city to participate in this GSA formation. They would be part of the GSA and members of the GSA. So, so that's one of the key benefits for us doing this is the more holistic management of the entire basin itself rather than just those portions within city limits that we have authority over right now.
So if you don't have a water district laying over one of those basins, like in the case of the county on the other fringes, does it default to the county to do so?
Correct.
And where are they on the Foothill one or wherever else in the city it's county land that might have wells in our basins, in the shared basins?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Jordan, they are involved in quite a few different GSAs throughout the county right now. They have, if there's another local water agency that wants to take the lead on the GSA formation, they have been deferring to that lead agency. If nobody steps up and wants to do one, then it would default to the county if a GSA formation was required.
Okay. And then that map you showed for Montecito Water District, just anecdotally, I've been told in the county, which would be Montecito Water District 2, that basically there's a period that you showed 1,000 of them, whatever, that there was a period of time several years ago where basically people were just putting wells down and they didn't need permission. True? False?
I think they are supposed to get it permitted through the county.
So
county has a
at
permitting
that time it was
process.
probably an over-the-counter, just turn in your piece of paper, go drill your well. Obviously, eventually there's consequences to that, and so the GSA process or MOU would help address that. But as of right now, in that particular situation adjacent to us, is it still just as easy as turn a piece of paper in, go drill your well?
The county's process, they review the well applications that come through, but the county is the agency that's overseeing that process and approving those permits.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Jordan, that's correct. There is nobody saying no. Okay. And the Montecito Water District was asking during the height, probably the 2014, 2015, asking the county board to take action to limit well drilling, at least temporarily. And unfortunately, the county wanted to implement something that would be countywide. And of course, that's not something that's even palatable North County, so it died there. I do want to remind the Commission that we have a moratorium on drilling wells within the city limits, particularly if any property is adjacent to city service. So we have, but that's within the city limits. We go into Mission Canyon, you go into kind of the Goleta area, and that doesn't limit you from drilling into the Foothill Basin.
So I'll just sneak in my comment. I would wholeheartedly encourage us to move forward on this, of course, only if we can get our adjacent neighbors to participate. I was on the Regional Water Board when this was passed by the governor, and most of our focus on this region was the Santa Maria Basin, which is an adjudicated area, but it's got a ton of problems. And they're obviously by that timeline they've had to get their first adoption, and they're working on their GSA plan right now. Okay. And there's we are lucky that we don't really have the heartbreaking stories that exist across the rest of the state, whether it's just from an infrastructure standpoint of stuff's sinking or poor communities that just have no access to water anymore because people have either overpumped or polluted the water flume, where traditionally they just pull water out of the ground and drink it. And we're lucky that we're in a situation where we have some relative affluence and we're able to treat our water, manage our water. But certainly one would be crazy not to, I would be crazy not to think that the future of our waters is going to really rely on our groundwater as a source. And to manage that responsibly with the adjacent stakeholders in a structured manner is going to be crucial to our success of that proactively rather than trying to react to all the problems that are elsewhere in the state. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
this isn't a later item, but there's the mention that our groundwater levels are at near historic lows on item 6E. So I'm interested in what is our plan, and maybe that comes up later, but as we're talking about that, what is our plan to have those recharged and at a sustainable level? And then 2 questions also about, so do we not have subsidence because it's sandstone underneath? We don't have the compression? So we can get to critically low without having subsidence. So we wouldn't see a surface expression even though it was happening, right? So,
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Sneddon, that's correct. It is because of the geology of our basins that we don't have the compaction issues that are in other parts of the state. Yeah. As for our plan to recharge the basins, our policy has always been to conjunctively manage the basins. We don't normally use our groundwater supplies extensively when we have normal to wet conditions and supplies from Kachuma and Gibraltar. We would rest our basins and allow the storage to build so that it's there for times of emergency. We're currently in an emergency, and we're now in the 7th year of drought, and so our groundwater basins are low. They're not as low as we've seen historically, but they are approaching low levels, and we've accounted for that in our supply planning. So we have an estimated yield that we think we could take out of storage, and once that yield is gone, we assume it's not there in our supply outlook for the next few years. And then after the drought, it's just a matter of resting our wells, allowing the natural recharge to occur over a period of time. And we also have this pilot study that we'll be working on to try and do some artificial recharge as well.
because that is assuming that there is an after the drought.
Assuming there's an after the drought, correct.
The big assumption.
And then I had one more question about what do we assume? Do we assume the connectivity throughout the basin is throughout the basin, or what is the radius from a well that they could be pulling in adjacent areas? So is it if you're in the basin, you could be drawing from anywhere in the basin, or is it locally what the radius might be or a range on that?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Sneddon, there is a what they call a cone of depression, where there's a radius that the water level impacts are deeper right at the well, and then they sort of come up. So we've been measuring water levels at that higher point as well as right at the well. So we have data for both right at the well and other parts of the basin.
So I guess my question is, in the overlaps where Montecito overlaps with our basins, what is the reach of that cone of depression to be drawing water out of the basin?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Sneddon, the way that the water flows is out towards the ocean normally, and because of where Montecito is pumping from the basin, it's intercepting what would go out to the ocean. It's not necessarily pulling from our area, so we don't expect that it's affecting the location of our wells. Our wells are pretty far away from the Montecito Basin. We're not right up against it with our wells. So I think we haven't suspected any impacts of the Montecito pumping on our basin.
Okay. Michael.
I just had a question about the GSAs. Are we proposing we're going to form two separate ones for our different basins, or just one for the entire region?
For the city's GSA?
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember, Commissioner Kilbourne, I'm sorry. Commissioner Kilbourne, we would form a GSA for each basin.
Okay.
And then, so for Storage Unit 1, the city's the only real known pumper, but Foothill Basin would have to have the other entities that are part of that GSA.
That was kind of my reason for the question. I think we're covered pretty well by the city code for Storage Unit 1, but the Foothill Basin, obviously we have a lot more competing interests, so it makes more sense to definitely move forward with trying to put that together for that basin.
Great. Hey, I just want to this is off the wall question. Back in the late 19th, early 20th century, Veronica Springs was like the Fiji water of the day. What happened to that storage basin that it can't be used potably today?
Do you have the history on that?
I don't know that it was ever that great based on I mean, what I understood is there was the Hidden Valley development that was built, and they built their own well.
The Veronica Springs actually was a resort, and they actually shipped water from the Veronica Springs nationally, right? It was healthy water, quote unquote, right? So I'm assuming everybody in the country was drinking bad water.
Well, maybe there is a spring that comes out of the Hope Ranch area versus what we're pumping out, which is
That really was my question.
Yeah.
That's where the term Veronica Springs come from. You look at the old pictures of that. It was a major resort, national resort in that regard. Anyway, good. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was, and we will keep on top of this information. It's now 11, so let's talk about agenda management. We're going to keep going, I'm assuming, for a few minutes. What's the commission's availability?